DiCaprio grew up worshiping Scorsese and ended up working with him. But when it comes to perfect films, his picks go way beyond their collaborations. In 2006, Leonardo DiCaprio sat down with The Independent and shared his list of favorite films: a banned Italian classic, a thriller that triggered an actual assassination attempt, and a war epic that made Spielberg want to be a director. These are the films Leo wants you to see. Leo has made it very clear over the years. He's obsessed with East of Eden. He's called it his favorite movie in multiple interviews, and he's watched it 5 times in a row. So yeah, this one really stuck with him. James Dean plays Cal, a troubled young man in 1917 California, who finds out his mother, who he thought was dead, is actually alive and running a brothel. The movie is based on the second half of John Steinbeck's novel, and that was very intentional. Director Elia Kazan didn't even like the first half of the book, so he told writer Paul Osborne to scrap it completely and just focus on the later part of the story. And in doing that, they ended up with one of the best movies ever made about young angst. Leo has talked about how James Dean's performance broke his heart. He once said, "There was something so raw and powerful about that performance. His vulnerability, his desperation to be loved. That performance just moved me completely." If you're talking about Italian cinema, Bicycle Thieves is the movie. Vittorio De Sica's masterpiece about a man trying to get his stolen bike back while his son watches every move he makes captures post-war Italy like nothing else. It's considered one of the greatest films ever made, but when it hit the US, the MPAA banned it. The issue was a single scene inside a brothel. That was enough to pull the film in 1950 for violating morality standards. Leo is a huge fan of this one. He actually got this one recommended to him by Scorsese, who worships this film. Scorsese once said that Italian films weren't just cinema to him, they felt like truth. The people in those movies spoke the same way as my family. Those films had something to do with who I am. And Leo's not the only one who swears by this movie. Danny Boyle, who worked with him on The Beach, actually put Bicycle Thieves in his top 5 favorite movies of all time. He straight up called it the most beautiful film about a father and a son that I've ever seen. Okay, obviously, a Scorsese film was going to be on this list. Taxi Driver is one of the greatest films ever made, and Leo was just 15 when he first saw it. He actually called it the greatest independent film ever made. Taxi Driver didn't just influence filmmakers. It influenced real life, sometimes in the worst way possible. It inspired someone like Tarantino, sure, but it also inspired an actual assassination attempt. In 1981, John Hinckley Jr. tried to kill President Ronald Reagan specifically to impress Jodie Foster, who played the teenage girl in Taxi Driver. And the Oscars were postponed. Reagan was supposed to appear in the ceremony's opening sequence, so after the shooting, the Academy had to delay everything until they were sure he was stable. That was only the 3rd postponement in Oscar history. Kubrick's masterpiece isn't just a horror classic, it's a movie that stays with you. But beyond all that, it's also infamous for what happened behind the scenes. Stephen King hated this adaptation, couldn't stand what Kubrick did to his story, but DiCaprio is a huge fan, and there's one thing in particular that still gets to him: the twins. He said straight up, "The twins in The Shining scare the living daylights out of me." I think that's one of the most powerful images in film, as far as terrifying is concerned. But part of why DiCaprio loves The Shining so much probably has to do with Jack Nicholson. Leo has so much respect for the guy. He once said, "Out of any actor, I can't think of anyone who's got more memorable moments in cinema than Jack Nicholson. And what makes Nicholson special is that he never plays a scene straight." Leo put it perfectly. He brings terror into what you thought was supposed to be a light moment and makes a light moment out of a cutthroat, vicious line. He flips everything on its side. Carol Reed fought with producer David Selznick over every detail. Selznick wanted to shoot on sound stages and make it more polished, but Reed refused. He shot everything on location in Vienna. right in the rubble of a city still recovering from World War II. And that is what makes it feel so real. It's easy to see why Leo considers it a must-watch. This movie has serious credentials. The British Film Institute named it the greatest British film of all time. Even Akira Kurosawa put it on his list of 100 favorite films. And Scorsese, who actually taught DiCaprio a lot about cinema and filmmaking, has been obsessed with it for years. When he was in film school, he even wrote a paper on The Third Man. Thought he nailed it too. But his professor wasn't impressed, gave him a B+ and told him, "Forget it, it's just a thriller." And speaking of Kurosawa, Yojimbo is one of those movies that just works. A nameless samurai rolls into town, finds two rival gangs tearing the place apart, and decides to play them against each other. Simple setup, perfect execution. If you've seen A Fistful of Dollars or Last Man Standing, you already know this story because both of those movies straight up lifted it from Yojimbo, and Kurosawa knew it. After seeing A Fistful of Dollars, he sent Sergio Leone a letter that just said, "I have just had the chance to see your film. It is a very fine film, but it is my film." Leone's wife even admitted that after watching Yojimbo, he immediately wanted to turn it into a Western. And he wasn't the only one. Kurosawa's influence is everywhere. DiCaprio loves it, and Scorsese has talked about it, especially Toshiro Mifune's performance. He once compared him to Baryshnikov, saying he had this graceful power, this ability to command a scene just by the way he moved. Shot in black and white, set to a Gershwin score, Manhattan is Woody Allen's love letter to New York. He plays a twice-divorced writer who can't commit to anything, and DiCaprio loves this movie. Allen himself hated it so much that he actually tried to stop the studio from releasing it. At one point, he even offered to direct another film for free if they just let him bury Manhattan. That didn't happen, obviously. And ironically, it became the most commercially successful movie of his career. To this day, he's still in disbelief that he got away with it. Critics were a little divided on this one. Roger Ebert, for example, had some issues with the way the movie shifts tone in the last 45 minutes. He thought Allen never quite figured out the balance between irony and sentiment. But even with those complaints, he still called it a very good movie. If there's one movie that perfectly captures the way Hollywood chews people up and spits them out, it's this one. It's narrated by a dead man telling the story of his own downfall, and Gloria Swanson absolutely owns the screen as Norma Desmond, a former silent film star desperately clinging to her past glory. DiCaprio's not the only one who loves this film. David Lynch once called Sunset Boulevard the greatest mood. You're immersed in it like a dream. He talked about how it connects old Hollywood with the present and how it carries through to today. Fellini's masterpiece about a filmmaker drowning in creative block. This movie is surreal, introspective, and basically required viewing for anyone obsessed with the creative process. It's one of those films that directors love. Scorsese, Lynch, and even Roger Ebert all swore by it. Ebert actually watched it over and over again, and he said his appreciation only deepened every time. He once wrote, "Fellini is a magician who discusses, reveals, explains, and deconstructs his tricks while still fooling us with them." And again, just like DiCaprio, David Lynch loved this one too. In his book, Catching the Big Fish, he picked 8.5 as one of the 4 films he considers examples of perfect filmmaking. If you're going to pick one epic, you might as well pick Lawrence of Arabia. This movie isn't just stunning to look at, it's a masterclass in storytelling, and DiCaprio's not the only one who considers it a favorite. This film made Spielberg want to be a director. And ironically, DiCaprio once joked that the only person who knows more about movies than Scorsese is Spielberg. This movie isn't about big action scenes or over-the-top drama. It's about scale, imagination, and pure cinematic experience. Roger Ebert once pointed out that when people talk about Lawrence of Arabia, they don't really discuss the plot. Instead, they get this look in their eyes like they're remembering a spectacle, an experience they can't quite put into words, and that's what makes it one of the greatest films ever made.